1968. The A Shau Valley. The jungle breathes around you, thick, wet air that tastes of decay and death. Every Marine knows how to fight an enemy with a rifle. They train for ambushes, booby traps, and sniper fire. But no amount of training prepares you for yellow eyes watching from the darkness, for the ghost that moves without sound through the green hell. 500 pounds of muscle and hunger that doesn't care about your night vision or your claymore mines. The Indochinese Tiger didn't take prisoners. It didn't follow the rules of war. It simply hunted. While you slept in your foxhole, it memorized your scent. While you set up your perimeter, it found the gaps. The enemy you could see was nothing compared to the one you couldn't. If you're a veteran watching this, you know these nightmares. For everyone else, subscribe for the untold stories that never made it into the history books. The heat hit like a physical wall the moment Sergeant Hawk Callahan stepped off the helicopter. 90 degrees at 9 in the morning, and the day was just beginning. The air hung thick and wet, carrying the smell of rotting vegetation and something else, something metallic that made his nostrils flare. Behind him, 4 Marines from the 3rd Recon Battalion shouldered their packs and followed him into the green maze of the A Shau Valley. Callahan had walked point through jungle terrain for 3 tours. He knew the weight of responsibility that came with being first. Every step could trigger a mine. Every bush could hide a sniper. But this morning felt different. The jungle pressed against them with an almost living presence, and the usual sounds seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Corporal Doc Ramirez adjusted his medical pack, feeling the familiar weight of bandages and morphine syrettes. The humidity made everything stick to his skin, his uniform, his equipment. Even the air he breathed felt thick enough to choke on. He'd learned to ignore discomfort, but something about this mission made his shoulders tense. Maybe it was the way Lance Corporal Buck Timmons kept glancing over his shoulder, or how Private First Class Sox Hawkins hadn't spoken since they'd landed. Timmons gripped his M16 tighter than necessary. 19 years old and 3 weeks in country, he'd volunteered for recon, thinking it would be cleaner than the grunt work. Surgical strikes instead of endless patrols through rice paddies. The jungle around them buzzed with insects he couldn't identify, their droning so constant it became a kind of silence. Every few steps, something would crack in the underbrush, and his head would snap toward the sound. Nothing there. Never anything there. Hawkins carried the radio that connected them to the outside world, but the jungle seemed determined to swallow even that lifeline. Static crackled through his headset as they moved deeper into the valley. The canopy above blocked most of the sunlight, leaving them in a perpetual green twilight that made distances impossible to judge. A tree 20 feet away could be 50. A shadow could be a rock or a crouching enemy. Their mission was simple in concept. Establish an observation post and monitor North Vietnamese army movement through the valley for 72 hours. A stingray operation. Sit still, watch, report. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. The intelligence reports mentioned increased enemy activity, supply routes, possible staging areas for attacks on American positions. What the reports didn't mention was how the jungle itself seemed to resist human presence. Callahan raised his hand, and the patrol froze. Something had changed in the forest's rhythm. The insect drone had shifted pitch, and somewhere in the distance, a monkey screamed, a sound like tearing metal. He studied the terrain ahead, noting the way the undergrowth had been disturbed, not the random pattern of wind or rain, but something deliberate, something that moved with purpose. The team waited while Callahan examined the ground. Broken twigs pointed in different directions than the wind would push them. Leaves had been crushed in a pattern that suggested weight, but not the scattered footprints of men. Whatever had passed this way was heavy and moved on 4 legs. Probably wild boar, he told himself. The valley was full of them. Ramirez felt sweat running down his back in steady streams. The medical training that had saved lives in firefights across 3 provinces felt useless here. He could treat gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, even severe burns from napalm strikes. But the jungle carried threats his medical knowledge couldn't address. Diseases that infected through the smallest cut. Parasites that entered through the soles of boots. Toxins from plants that could kill with a single touch. Every breath brought the possibility of infection. They moved in single file, Callahan picking their path through the densest part of the forest. The undergrowth grew so thick in places that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Thorns caught at their uniforms and equipment, making every step an effort. The sound of their passage seemed impossibly loud. Boots squelching in mud, branches snapping, gear rattling despite their best efforts at silence. Timmons had read about jungle warfare in training manuals that made it sound like a tactical problem with solutions. Maintain noise discipline. Watch for signs of enemy movement. Use the terrain to your advantage. But the manuals hadn't prepared him for the way the jungle seemed to watch back. Eyes in the darkness that might be shadows, or might be something else. The constant feeling that they were being evaluated by an intelligence that understood this environment far better than they ever would. Hawkins tried to raise base camp on the radio, but got only static in return. The jungle absorbed radio waves the same way it absorbed sound, and light, and hope. He adjusted the frequency, and tried again, hearing nothing but electronic snow. They were alone in a way that felt absolute, cut off from the world of helicopters and artillery support and medical evacuation. If something happened here, they would face it with nothing but what they carried. The patrol reached their designated observation point after 4 hours of movement. A small clearing on a ridge that provided limited visibility down into the valley. Callahan studied the site through his binoculars, noting potential fields of fire and escape routes. Standard procedure, but his instincts kept pulling his attention to the tree line. Something about the way the shadows fell didn't look right. They established a defensive perimeter, each Marine taking responsibility for a sector of observation. Claymore mines went out 50 meters from their position, positioned to cover the most likely approaches. Trip flares were set along potential infiltration routes. By evening, they had created a small bubble of American military technology in the vast green wilderness. As darkness fell, the jungle came alive with sounds they couldn't identify. Rustling that might be wind or might be movement. Calls that might come from birds or might come from something else entirely. The night vision equipment showed heat signatures moving through the forest. Some small and quick, others larger and more deliberate. Most stayed at a distance, but something was circling their perimeter just beyond the range of their sensors. Callahan took the first watch, studying the darkness through his scope. The jungle at night was a different creature than the jungle by day. Sounds carried differently. Distances became impossible to judge. And somewhere in that green maze, something was learning their patterns, memorizing their scents, and deciding whether they were predators or prey. Day 2 began before dawn with the sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Not the crack of sniper fire or the whistle of incoming mortars, but something deeper and more primal. A low growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Callahan jerked awake in his foxhole, hand instinctively moving to his rifle. The sound had lasted only seconds, but it left an impression in his chest like the afterimage of a lightning flash. The jungle around their perimeter had gone completely silent. No insects, no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the constant drip of moisture from the canopy had stopped. Hawkins lay flat in his position, barely breathing, listening to his own heartbeat thunder in his ears. The radio beside him crackled with static, but the sound seemed obscenely loud in the dead quiet that had settled over the forest. Ramirez checked his watch through the green glow of his night vision scope. 3:47 in the morning, the darkest hour, when human vision failed completely, and the jungle belonged to creatures that had evolved to hunt in absolute blackness. He could smell his own fear sweat mixing with the ever-present odors of rot and damp earth. His medical pack felt heavier than usual, weighted down with supplies that might not matter if they faced something that couldn't be stopped with bandages and morphine. Timmons had never experienced silence like this. Growing up in Ohio, quiet meant you could hear cars passing on distant highways or dogs barking in neighboring yards. This was the absence of sound itself, as if every living thing in the forest had simultaneously decided to stop existing. He pressed his face against the mud wall of his foxhole and tried to control his breathing. The M16 in his hands felt inadequate, designed for an enemy that followed predictable patterns of movement and behavior. The growl came again, closer this time. A sound that started low in the register of hearing and climbed until it became a physical sensation in their bones. Callahan had heard tigers in zoos, but this was different, deeper, hungrier. It carried a quality of patience that suggested intelligence, as if whatever made the sound understood that time was on its side. The jungle was its domain, and these 5 humans were visitors who had overstayed their welcome. 30 minutes passed before the normal sounds of the forest returned. Insects began their droning chorus again, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called tentatively, testing whether it was safe to announce its presence. But the Marines remained frozen in their positions, each man suddenly aware of how exposed they were, despite their carefully constructed perimeter. The claymore mines and trip flares that had seemed like adequate protection the night before now felt like children's toys scattered around a playground. When dawn finally broke through the canopy, Callahan crawled from his foxhole to examine the area around their position. 20 feet from Timmons' fighting hole, he found the first tracks. 4 pads and claws pressed deep into the soft earth, each print the size of a dinner plate. The spacing between them suggested an animal of enormous size, moving with deliberate care, placing each step to minimize sound. The tracks circled their entire perimeter, sometimes passing within arm's reach of their defensive positions. Ramirez joined him at the track site, studying the impressions with the analytical mind that had served him well in medical school. The depth of the prints indicated an animal weighing at least 400 pounds, probably more. The claw marks were fresh, made sometime during the night while they had lain in their holes, listening to their own breathing. He tried to calculate how something that large could move silently enough to avoid detection by 5 trained Marines with night vision equipment and motion sensors. The realization hit all of them at roughly the same time. They were no longer the hunters. The mission parameters that had seemed straightforward during the briefing, observe and report enemy, movement, had shifted overnight. Now they were being observed, evaluated, and tracked by something that possessed advantages they couldn't counter. Night vision that made their equipment look primitive, hearing sensitive enough to detect a human heartbeat from 50 yards away, and most importantly, an understanding of this terrain that came from millions of years of evolution. Timmons found himself jumping at sounds that would have passed unnoticed the day before. A branch falling somewhere in the forest made him spin around, rifle raised, before he realized it was nothing. But the question remained. How do you tell the difference between nothing and something that moves like nothing? His training had prepared him to identify muzzle flashes and the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire. It had not prepared him to distinguish between the sound of wind moving through leaves and the sound of a 500-pound predator shifting its weight from one paw to another. By midday, the heat had climbed past 100 degrees, and the humidity made breathing feel like drowning. Their water supplies, carefully rationed for a 72-hour mission, suddenly seemed inadequate. Stress and fear burned calories and depleted fluids faster than normal operations, and the constant vigilance required to scan for threats that might not be threats was exhausting in ways their training hadn't covered. Hawkins tried repeatedly to raise base camp on the radio, but the jungle seemed to swallow their transmissions. Static and electronic interference made communication impossible beyond a few hundred yards. They were isolated in a way that felt absolute, cut off from artillery support, medical evacuation, and the reassuring knowledge that help was available if needed. Whatever happened in this green maze would have to be resolved with nothing but small arms and the tactical knowledge of 5 Marines who were discovering that their education had significant gaps. The tracks appeared again during their afternoon watch rotation. Fresh prints in mud, that had been dry 4 hours earlier, following a path that took the animal completely around their position. The methodical nature of the stalking behavior suggested intelligence and planning rather than random animal movement. Something was learning their routines, memorizing their positions, and possibly waiting for the optimal moment to act. Callahan studied the tree line through his binoculars, searching for any sign of movement or the telltale glint of eyes reflecting sunlight. The jungle stared back at him with the blank indifference of a landscape that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations without changing its essential character. Somewhere in that green maze, an apex predator was making decisions about their fate based on criteria they couldn't understand or influence. As evening approached, each Marine settled into his fighting position with the knowledge that darkness would bring a return of the terror that had paralyzed them the night before. The jungle around them seemed to pulse with hidden life, and every shadow could conceal yellow eyes watching their preparations with the patient interest of a creature that understood it held every advantage in the coming confrontation. The attack came at 2:13 in the morning on their third night in the valley. Hawkins was pulling radio watch when he heard the Claymore mine detonate 50 meters to his left, followed immediately by a scream that cut through the jungle darkness like a blade through silk. The explosion lit the forest in a brief orange flash that revealed nothing but smoke and shattered vegetation, but the scream continued, high and desperate and unmistakably human. Timmons was gone from his fighting hole. The foxhole that had contained a 19-year-old Marine from Ohio 30 seconds earlier now held only his helmet and a section of communication wire that had been snapped clean through. The Claymore blast had triggered automatically when something heavy enough crossed the tripwire, but instead of stopping the threat, it had only announced the beginning of something far worse than any of them had imagined possible. Callahan rolled out of his position with his rifle ready, night vision scope activated, scanning the tree line for movement. The infrared signature showed heat sources scattered throughout the forest, some large, some small, all moving in patterns that suggested panic rather than tactical coordination. But there was something else, something massive and controlled, dragging a warm object through the underbrush with purposeful efficiency that made his stomach clench with recognition of what he was seeing. The screaming had stopped abruptly, replaced by sounds that Ramirez's medical training helped him identify with sickening clarity. The wet, tearing noise of flesh separating from bone, the distinctive crack of ribs breaking under pressure, and underneath it all, a low rumbling that might have been purring if it had come from a house cat instead of something that could bite through a human spine with the casual ease of snapping a pencil. Ramirez grabbed his medical pack and started toward the sound, but Callahan's hand on his shoulder stopped him before he had taken 3 steps. Moving toward a wounded Marine violated every instinct that had kept him alive through 3 tours of combat medicine. But approaching a tiger actively feeding on human prey would accomplish nothing except adding another casualty to the night's toll. The harsh mathematics of survival in hostile territory sometimes required choices that destroyed the men who made them. The dragging sounds continued for another 2 minutes, moving steadily away from their perimeter and deeper into the jungle. Whatever had taken Timmons was strong enough to pull a fully equipped Marine through dense undergrowth without apparent effort, and intelligent enough to avoid the remaining Claymore positions that protected their camp. The systematic way it had bypassed their defenses suggested reconnaissance and planning rather than opportunistic predation. Hawkins tried desperately to raise base camp on the radio, knowing that standard operating procedure required immediate notification of casualties and requests for emergency extraction. But the static that answered his transmission attempts seemed louder now, more hostile, as if the jungle itself was interfering with their communications equipment. The isolation that had been merely uncomfortable during daylight hours became absolute in the darkness following Timmons' disappearance. When dawn finally arrived, they found the trail. Disturbed earth and broken vegetation marked a path that led directly away from Timmons' fighting hole and into the deepest part of the valley. Scattered along the route were pieces of equipment that had been torn loose during the dragging process: a compass, several rifle magazines, and a single combat boot with the laces still tied, but the leather scored by deep claw marks that had penetrated completely through to the foot that had been wearing it. The blood trail ended at a stream bank 200 meters from their position. Beyond the water, the jungle showed no signs of disturbance, as if whatever had taken Timmins had simply vanished into the green maze with its burden. Callahan studied the scene through his binoculars, noting the efficiency with which all traces of the abduction had been eliminated once the predator reached terrain of its own choosing. Ramirez knelt beside the abandoned boot, examining the claw marks with the analytical detachment that medical training had taught him to maintain in crisis situations. The scoring patterns indicated claws approximately 3 inches long, curved for gripping and tearing rather than slashing. The spacing between the marks suggested a paw pad roughly 8 inches across, consistent with an animal weighing between 400 and 600 pounds. An Indochinese tiger in the prime of its hunting life. The decision to continue the mission or request immediate extraction should have been straightforward, but their communication equipment had failed completely during the night. Whether due to equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference, or deliberate jamming by enemy forces, they could no longer contact the outside world. They were alone in a valley that contained not only North Vietnamese army units, but also an apex predator that had demonstrated both the ability and inclination to hunt human prey. Hawkins disassembled the radio and checked each component systematically, looking for obvious signs of damage or malfunction. The equipment appeared functional, but every attempt to establish contact with base camp resulted in nothing but electronic noise. The possibility that they had been written off as missing in action and abandoned to their fate in the jungle became increasingly difficult to dismiss as the day wore on without any sign of search aircraft or relief columns. By afternoon, the psychological impact of Timmins's disappearance had begun to manifest in ways that threatened their remaining operational effectiveness. Every sound in the forest now represented a potential threat that required immediate tactical response. Bird calls became enemy signals. Falling branches indicated movement in the canopy above their heads. The normal background noise of jungle wildlife transformed into an acoustic landscape of paranoia and dread. Callahan found himself second-guessing decisions that should have been automatic after years of combat experience. Routes that looked safe might conceal ambush positions. Defensive positions that offered good fields of fire might also provide easy approach paths for something that moved through the forest with advantages human technology couldn't counter. The tactical knowledge that had kept him alive through dozens of similar missions seemed inadequate when faced with an enemy that operated outside the conventional rules of warfare. The Tiger returned that evening, circling their perimeter with the same methodical patience it had displayed the previous night. But now they could hear it moving through the underbrush, deliberately making enough noise to announce its presence without revealing its exact location. The psychological warfare was as sophisticated as anything employed by human combatants, designed to erode their confidence and decision-making capability through sustained application of stress and uncertainty. Ramirez realized that his medical supplies, carefully inventoried for a standard reconnaissance mission, contained nothing that would be effective against the toxins injected by a tiger bite. The massive canine teeth of an adult tiger could puncture completely through a human torso, and the bite force of nearly 1,000 pounds per square inch would crush bones and organs before blood loss became the primary cause of death. His training had prepared him for gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries, not predation by an animal that had evolved specifically to kill large mammals. As darkness settled over the valley for their 4th night in enemy territory, the 3 surviving Marines understood that their mission parameters had changed completely. They were no longer gathering intelligence on enemy troop movements. They were trying to survive until dawn in an environment where they represented nothing more than prey for a creature that possessed every possible advantage in the coming confrontation. By the 4th day, exhaustion had become their most dangerous enemy. None of the 3 surviving Marines had slept for more than 20 minutes at a stretch since Timmins disappeared. The constant hypervigilance required to scan for threats that might materialize from any direction at any moment had pushed their nervous systems beyond normal operating parameters. Callahan's hands shook when he tried to hold his binoculars steady and simple. Tasks like reloading magazines required concentrated effort that should have been automatic. The heat had climbed past 110 degrees, and their water supplies were running critically low. Each man was rationed to 4 ounces every 2 hours, barely enough to replace the fluids lost through constant sweating and the accelerated metabolism that fear produced. Dehydration symptoms were beginning to manifest in ways that degraded their tactical effectiveness. Blurred vision, difficulty concentrating, and a persistent headache that made decision-making feel like pushing through thick mud. Ramirez had developed a tremor in his left hand that made precise medical procedures impossible. The combination of sleep deprivation, heat stress, and psychological trauma was producing physiological changes that his medical training helped him recognize but couldn't prevent. His pulse rate had been elevated for over 60 hours, and the constant flood of adrenaline and cortisol was beginning to exhaust his endocrine system. Even if they survived the tiger, the damage being done to their bodies might take months to repair. The jungle around their defensive position had become a hostile entity that seemed to actively resist their presence. Insects swarmed their faces in clouds so thick that breathing required constant spitting and wiping. Leeches found their way through gaps in clothing and attached themselves to skin that was already raw from heat rash and infected scratches. The smell of their own bodies, unwashed for 4 days in tropical heat, mixed with the ever-present odors of rot and decay until the air itself seemed poisonous. Hawkins had stopped trying to repair the radio after discovering that several critical components had been chewed through during the night. Tooth marks in the plastic housing and severed wires suggested deliberate sabotage rather than random animal curiosity. The tiger wasn't just hunting them, it was systematically eliminating their advantages, cutting off their lifelines to the outside world with intelligence that bordered on tactical planning. The psychological pressure of being watched constantly had begun to manifest in ways that threatened their remaining sanity. Every shadow could conceal yellow eyes, evaluating their movements. Every sound in the forest might herald the approach of something that could kill them before they had time to raise their weapons. The paranoia that had started as appropriate tactical awareness had metastasized into something that made rational thought nearly impossible. Callahan found himself making decisions based on fear rather than tactical analysis. Routes that looked safe were avoided because they felt wrong. Defensive positions that offered good fields of fire were abandoned because they seemed too exposed. The instincts that had kept him alive through years of combat were being overwhelmed by terror of an enemy that operated outside his understanding of warfare and predation. The tiger's behavior had evolved throughout their stay in the valley. What had started as simple stalking had become psychological warfare designed to break their resistance through sustained application of stress. It would circle their perimeter just inside the range of visibility, allowing them brief glimpses of orange and black stripes moving between trees. Then it would disappear completely, leaving them to wonder if it had lost interest or if it was positioning for an attack from an unexpected direction. During the afternoon of their 4th day, Ramirez discovered fresh claw marks on trees surrounding their position. The scoring was too high off the ground to have been made by the tiger standing on its hind legs. It had climbed the trunks to mark territory at eye level for a standing human. The message was unmistakable. This was its domain, and they were trespassing in a place where human technology and training provided no meaningful advantage. The realization that they were being played with rather than hunted outright was perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of their situation. A direct attack, even if it resulted in casualties, would at least provide an opportunity to respond with violence of their own. But this systematic psychological dismantling offered no target for their weapons and no clear course of action that might improve their circumstances. Water became their most critical concern as the day progressed. The stream where they had found the last traces of Timmons was their only source of fresh water. but approaching it meant leaving the relative security of their defensive position and exposing themselves to attack during the most vulnerable activity they could undertake. Yet dehydration would kill them as effectively as tiger claws if they remained in their holes, waiting for a confrontation that might never come. Callahan made the decision to move toward the stream during the late afternoon, when the tiger had historically been less active. The 50-meter movement through dense undergrowth required 40 minutes of crawling and careful observation, with frequent stops to listen for sounds that might indicate they were being followed. Every broken twig and rustling leaf could announce their position to something whose hearing was sensitive enough to detect a human heartbeat from 100 yards away. The water they collected was brown with sediment and tasted of decaying vegetation, but it was liquid and it was available. Each man filled his canteen and drank deeply, knowing that contaminated water might cause dysentery or parasitic infection, but understanding that immediate dehydration was a more pressing threat than future illness. The jungle offered no good choices, only degrees of risk that had to be evaluated and accepted. The return trip to their defensive position revealed fresh tiger tracks along the route they had taken to reach the stream. The prints were still damp, made while they had been filling their canteens, less than 20 meters away. The tiger had shadowed their movement, possibly close enough to attack at any moment, but had chosen instead to let them complete their mission and return to their holes. The restraint demonstrated intelligence and planning that made their situation far more desperate than simple predation would have been. As night fell on their 4th day in the valley, the 3 surviving Marines understood that their endurance was nearly exhausted. The combination of sleep deprivation, dehydration, heat stress, and psychological trauma had degraded their operational effectiveness to levels that made survival increasingly unlikely. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon, because their bodies and minds could not sustain the current level of stress much longer without complete breakdown. The jungle around them pulsed with hidden life as darkness settled over the valley, and somewhere in that green maze, yellow eyes were making final preparations for whatever would unfold during the long hours before dawn. The final confrontation began at 3:27 in the morning, when Hawkins felt hot breath on the back of his neck. He had been dozing fitfully in his foxhole, radio headsets still clamped over his ears in the desperate hope that communications might be restored, when the unmistakable sensation of another living creature's respiration against his skin brought him to full consciousness with the absolute clarity that comes only in moments of mortal terror. The tiger was directly behind him, close enough that he could smell the copper scent of blood on its breath and feel the vibration of its purring through the mud walls of his fighting position. Moving with infinite care, Hawkins began to reach for his rifle, but the low growl that answered his movement made it clear that any sudden action would trigger an attack that would end his life before he could complete the motion. He remained frozen, barely breathing, while predator and prey evaluated each other in the green darkness of the jungle night. Callahan heard the growl from his position 20 meters away and understood immediately that their careful defensive preparations had been rendered meaningless. Whatever was happening to Hawkins was happening inside their perimeter, which meant the tiger had approached through terrain they had thought was secure, bypassing motion sensors and trip flares with the kind of stealth that made human military training look clumsy by comparison. He began moving toward Hawkins' position, but in the darkness and dense vegetation, even 20 meters might as well have been 20 miles. The attack itself lasted less than 10 seconds. Hawkins felt massive jaws close around his shoulders and chest, the 4-inch canine teeth punching through his flak jacket and into the muscle underneath, with enough force to crack his ribs and puncture his right lung. The bite pressure of nearly 1,000 pounds per square inch compressed his torso like a vice, making breathing impossible and sending shockwaves of pain through his nervous system that nearly caused immediate unconsciousness. Then he was being dragged backward out of his foxhole, boots scraping furrows in the mud as the tiger hauled him through the undergrowth with casual efficiency that demonstrated the vast gulf between human strength and the physical capabilities of an apex predator that had evolved specifically to kill large mammals. His rifle fell from nerveless fingers, and his radio headset was torn loose by thorns and hanging branches as he was pulled deeper into the jungle. Ramirez heard the commotion and grabbed his medical pack, knowing that whatever was happening would require immediate trauma care if there was going to be any chance of survival. But by the time he reached Hawkins's fighting position, there was nothing left except disturbed earth and a blood trail that led directly away from their perimeter and into the densest part of the valley. The systematic way the Tiger had eliminated their radio operator suggested planning and intelligence that went far beyond simple predatory behavior. Callahan made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of pursuing the Tiger into terrain where it held every possible advantage, he opened fire with his M16 on full automatic, spraying 20 rounds in the direction of the dragging sounds. The muzzle flashes lit the jungle in brief orange strobes that revealed nothing except smoke and shattered vegetation. But the firing had an immediate effect. The dragging sounds stopped abruptly, followed by a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The silence that followed was worse than the attack. No more dragging sounds, no human voices calling for help, no indication whether Hawkins was alive or dead, or whether the gunfire had driven off the Tiger or simply convinced it to find a more secure location for whatever it intended to do next. Callahan and Ramirez crouched in their fighting positions, listening to their own rapid breathing and the gradual return of normal jungle sounds, knowing that they had just lost their second man in 4 days to an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't track, and couldn't fight using conventional tactics. Dawn revealed the effectiveness of the Tiger's hunting strategy. The trail where Hawkins had been dragged ended at the same stream bank where they had lost all traces of Timmons 3 nights earlier. Beyond the water, the jungle showed no signs of disturbance, as if both Marines had simply vanished into the green maze without leaving any evidence of their fate. The systematic elimination of their team members was proceeding with an efficiency that suggested long-term planning rather than opportunistic predation. The psychological impact of losing Hawkins was immediate and devastating. Their radio operator had been their last connection to the outside world, and with him gone, they were truly isolated in an environment that had demonstrated its hostility in the most direct way possible. The knowledge that no help was coming, that no rescue operation would extract them if they couldn't extract themselves, settled over the 2 survivors like a suffocating blanket. Ramirez found himself unable to focus on basic tasks that should have been automatic after years of military training. Loading magazines required conscious effort and multiple attempts. Reading his compass became an exercise in concentration that left him exhausted. The combination of sleep deprivation, malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma was producing cognitive deficits that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. Callahan faced the hardest choice of his military career. Standard operating procedure called for them to remain in position and continue their observation mission until the scheduled extraction date, still 24 hours away. But their defensive position had been compromised, their communications equipment was destroyed, and they were facing an enemy that had already demonstrated the ability to penetrate their perimeter at will. Staying meant certain death. Moving meant probable death, but at least offered the possibility of reaching friendly territory before their physical and mental resources were completely exhausted. The decision to abandon their mission came at 10:30 in the morning, when they found fresh tiger tracks circling their position in broad daylight. The animal was no longer bothering to conceal its presence, suggesting that it had moved beyond stalking behavior into the final phase of whatever hunting strategy it was employing. The tracks indicated an animal in the prime of its physical condition, weighing at least 500 pounds, with claws and teeth capable of killing an adult human in seconds. They began their movement toward the extraction point at noon, carrying only essential equipment and leaving behind anything that might slow their progress through the jungle. The claymore mines and trip flares that had provided psychological comfort, if not actual security, were abandoned in place. Extra ammunition, rations, and medical supplies that might have sustained them for another week were discarded in favor of speed and mobility. The jungle through which they moved seemed different now, actively hostile in ways that went beyond the normal challenges of tropical terrain. Thorns caught at their equipment with deliberate malice. Mud sucked at their boots with the persistence of quicksand. Insects swarmed them in clouds so thick that forward visibility dropped to less than 5 feet, and every step forward required conscious effort that drained their already depleted energy reserves. Behind them, somewhere in the green maze they were fleeing, something large and patient was following their trail with the methodical persistence of a creature that understood it held every advantage in the approaching final confrontation. The jungle was its domain, and they were simply the last pieces in a game that had been decided from the moment they had stepped off the helicopter 4 days earlier.